Let's go into a meeting into which neither you nor I were invited. About a month ago, Tim Cook from Apple was in China, and there is obviously...
Awkward.
Right. There's obviously a drive amongst many companies, including Apple, to diversify their manufacturing out of China. Some are full bore pulling out, but a company like Apple that has so much of its manufacturing in China can cause some real mayhem within Apple.
Beyond painful. If it wasn't for a company with Apple's cash reserves, it would be a system-ending event.
Yeah, that's right.
A lot of countries, a lot of companies have seen the writing on the wall for a while, and whether it was because of COVID disruptions or Trump or now the Biden subsidies, whatever it happened to be, the descent into narcissistic nationalism, people have been backing away. Labor costs are a big piece of that too, with different speeds from different starting points with different exposures. But the writing on the wall has been absorbed by everyone in the international business community, with the exception of Apple.
Yeah.
Now, about a year ago, Apple did start relocating, or maybe a year and a half ago now, did start relocating like the AirPods manufacturing to Vietnam. And that was the first product that they had that they actually decided, maybe we shouldn't put it all in China. So they are the last company to come to the conclusion that there might be a problem.
Yeah.
Now, in Apple's defense, the very concept of globalization is underwritten by the American security order. And the Americans have never said flat out that they're done. It's just kind of been a bit by bit retreat. But now that it's more obvious, and now that the Biden administration is codifying Trump's policies, and now that labor costs in China are so high, and now that the Chinese government is actually criminalizing the act of owning data by private corporations. That's a new one this month. That was delicious. Apple is realizing that, maybe we shouldn't have 91% of our supply chain steps involved in China in some way. No matter how fast they relocate at this point, they can't get out fast enough, because an iPhone is a lot like a car, where if you miss one of those pieces, you just have a paperweight.
That's right. But exactly.
Most vehicles that are sold in the United States are 85% manufactured here. So getting the last few pieces, there's already a network effect going for you in the United States and Mexico, and to a lesser degree Canada. There's nothing like that with Apple. They're going to have to rebuild the entire ecosystem, and that is a minimum of 5 years.
Who do you think had the power in that conversation, though? Was it Xi, or was it Tim Cook?
It's hard to say that Xi has any power because of the lack of information. So he certainly has the authority to shut things down, but he can't necessarily do anything to help Tim Cook, because that means going against the demographic and strategic realities of the country, not to mention Xi's own personal aura. Cook says he would like to leave, but remember, we are now dealing with a Chinese leader who is a son of the Cultural Revolution. And if for the low price of a famine and strategic defeat and deindustrialization, he can retain power, he probably thinks that's okay. So the sort of leverage that Apple would normally have with a normal country just doesn't exist here. This was probably a conversation among people who were desperate in their own ways, who realized the person across the desk really couldn't do much to help them out.
Just the capacity for mayhem.
Yeah, and there's plenty of that.
Yeah, I have actually taken a drive from Hanoi to Halong Bay, and you go past the Foxconn facilities, and they are some of the largest buildings I have ever seen in my entire life. You're driving past them for minutes, and you can see exactly what is coming in an environment in which China is no longer a partner.
Yeah. Now there's one slightly less bad aspect to that. Those Foxconn facilities, for the most part, this is an overgeneralization, but for the most part, they're assembly facilities as opposed to manufacturing facilities. And that means of those 91% of the supply chain steps, a lot of them, various parts come to China are assembled into another part, which is then sent out and incorporated in another part. That goes over and over and over again. So assembly, while a critical part of the manufacturing process, is a little bit simpler. I wouldn't say easy, but simpler to replace somewhere else. The problem we're going to have, not just with the iPhones and cellular, but electronics in general, is that the Chinese for the last 20 years have provided fingers and eyes for the assembly process, as opposed to going an automation route, because the numbers have been there, they've been there in volume, and the security environment has allowed them to be co-located with a lot of these manufacturing facilities. If we lose that, there is no singular place anywhere else in the world that has that number of fingers and eyes at scale. India doesn't have the quality control, and they're not all in the same infrastructure. Mexicans are too skilled. So we're going to have to assemble in a different way than we have in the past.
So I had started with a question. You have spent the last 20 minutes answering it. I'm going to throw it out there anyway, if for nothing else, for a little bit of a chuckle. But so in the thought of investing in anything to do with China,
I would just warn you, before you short China, the other side has to survive for you to profit from the short. It has been the fate of most stock markets throughout history to go to zero. It is only in the globalized order that the luxury of shorting things has existed. We're going to be going back to a little bit older of a system.
I have a beautiful old chart that was put together by the Bank of Japan, and it shows interest rates over an 1,100-year period, starting everywhere in which fractional banking was practiced, and the lowest point in terms of interest rates over that 1,100-year period was in the last decade.
Oh, and that's demographics as well.
How so?
So as you get older, you get more money and your consumption changes. So in your 20s and your 30s, you're buying homes and houses and raising kids, and your income is low, so you have to borrow. So capital is relatively scarce in an environment where there's a lot of 20 and 30 somethings. But once you hit about 45 and you start thinking about retirement and your kids are moving out, you've already bought your house, maybe you upgrade your car, but it's never going to be as big of a hit to the economy as buying your first one. And you're probably going to start thinking about downsizing. So, you're actually negative on housing, but your income's the highest it will ever be. So societies that have more people in their mid 40s and on to early 60s are very capital rich, which pushes down borrowing costs, including interest rates across the board.